It was a quiet day in a small village nestled at the foot of the mountains, where the wind howled through the tall trees and swept across the green fields. The sun had begun to set beyond the horizon, and the scent of rich, damp soil filled the air. In that village stood an old house, decades old, surrounded by a weathered wooden fence. This house belonged to my grandfather, a man who often told me strange stories about events the human mind could scarcely comprehend. I was a child when I sat beside my grandfather on a cold evening in the winter of 2003. He was in his usual wooden chair in front of our house, watching the gray sky as rain began to pour heavily. I was used to his stories, which blended reality and imagination, but that night, something unusual happened. He told me a story unlike any I had heard before. In a calm voice, as if recalling a distant memory that had suddenly resurfaced, my grandfather said, "I've lived in this house since I was young, and I've seen strange things, but there's one story I can never forget." He leaned on his hand, his eyes fixed on the distance, as though he were seeing something invisible to me. Taking a deep breath, he began his tale, his voice carrying an otherworldly weight. One day, I was sitting on the chair outside the house. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just about to set. Everything was peaceful. The only sound was the wind, but then I heard her voice. Her voice was calling my name, and I knew it was hers. She said, "Come here. I have something important to tell you." The problem was my wife, my beloved, had passed away years before that moment. My grandfather paused, closing his eyes as though trying to piece together the details. Then he continued, "I was sure it was her." The voice was clear, carrying the same gentle whispers she used when she called me during her life. It kept repeating, growing louder and more distinct with each moment. I felt something strange, as though an unseen force was pulling me inside. At first, I ignored it, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at me. It was as if my very soul was being drawn toward the house. As he recounted the story, I noticed a slight tremor in his body, though I couldn't tell whether it was from the cold or the memory itself. I listened intently, hanging on his every word, knowing this story was unlike the others. And then, I couldn't resist anymore. I felt as if something terrible would happen if I didn't move. I stood up and rushed toward the door, opening it quickly. At that moment, it felt as though my heart had dropped into an abyss. I heard a deafening sound behind me, like something massive had hit the ground, followed by the heavy clang of metal. It was the sound of a collapse, echoing so fiercely that it seemed to pierce my ears. My grandfather took a deep breath before continuing. I hurried inside, and when I looked back, the sight was horrifying. The chair I had been sitting on was completely shattered beneath the weight of something enormous, something heavy that had fallen from above. A metal pipe had dislodged from the roof's edge, crashing down with incredible force onto the chair. That iron pipe was so heavy that it completely destroyed the chair. If I hadn't moved at that moment, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. He fell silent for a while as the wind howled outside. I sat there, wide-eyed and stunned, my mouth slightly open in amazement. The vivid details of his story painted a picture in my mind, and a creeping sense of fear began to settle over me. Finally, my grandfather spoke again, his voice hoarse. Whenever I think about that moment, I feel like something unseen was trying to save me. Was it her spirit? Or was there something else watching over me? At this, he stopped speaking and gave me a piercing look, as though he wanted to leave me with the riddle to unravel. A few days had passed since the session where my grandfather told me about the strange incident that nearly claimed his life. The story was still spinning in my mind, following me with every step I took. Although I wanted to ask him for more details, I couldn't help but feel a tinge of fear every time I thought of bringing it up. My grandfather seemed burdened, as if he carried secrets too deep to reveal. As I walked along the dusty paths of the small village during those cold days, everything seemed the same yet felt entirely different. There was something invisible, something strange, trailing me from beyond the horizon, as if the past my grandfather was trying to forget had begun creeping into the present. I had a nagging feeling that what had happened to him back then was somehow linked to what was unfolding in my life now. One day, I decided to return to that old house. The house was abandoned now, and the youth of the village had left in search of new lives in the city. No one visited the place anymore, leaving only ancient memories to linger there. The house was unkempt, overgrown with moss on its walls, and its windows sealed shut by the dust of time. As I stepped into the courtyard, a strange sensation crept over me. The atmosphere was gloomy, and the surrounding trees bent under the weight of the winds that lashed against them. I felt as if I were entering a place I might never leave, as though my footsteps were leading me toward an unknown fate. Still, I couldn't stop myself from moving forward. My curiosity was stronger than any fear. I entered the room my grandfather had described, the one where the strange incident had occurred. The ceiling was low, the space narrow, and the furniture broken and wrapped in layers of dust. The wooden chair he had spoken of was still there in the corner, bearing the marks of time. The place was eerie, yet something inside me urged me to sit in that chair. I sat down, trying to imagine myself in my grandfather's place at that moment. Sitting in this chair, hearing the voice of his late wife calling to him from inside the house. I tried to focus on every detail he had shared with me, as if I were searching for an answer to an unspoken question. Suddenly, I felt something unnatural. The sounds around me began to shift. The wind blew faster, but this time from unusual directions, as though it were circling me. Moment by moment, the sound of trees and grasses outside grew louder, yet there was something else mingling with it. It felt as though whispers, soft, indistinct, were slipping through the natural noises of the place. These whispers carried a familiar tone. They weren't the wind. They were human. A delicate voice floated through the air, drifting around the room. My heartbeat quickened, and my breathing became labored. The voice grew closer and closer. "Is it you?" I whispered to myself, my eyes darting across the shadowy corners. A heavy weight pressed against my chest, as though the walls were closing in on me. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. Before I could make sense of anything, a heavy thud echoed behind me. I was accustomed to the sound of things falling in old houses, but this was different, sharper, louder, clearer. It sounded as though something enormous had dropped. My body jerked in alarm, and I quickly turned to see the source. But there was nothing there. Complete silence. Nothing visible. I was alone in that dark, suffocating place, with an eerie feeling that stole my breath. My breathing grew heavier, and I decided it was time to leave. Yet I felt something strange following me. I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I headed for the door, but just as I reached it, I saw something move in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow, or perhaps just a tree swaying in the wind. I wasn't sure. The shadows moved unnaturally, as if they were afraid of being seen. I rushed toward the door, but before I could open it, I felt a heavy touch on my shoulder. It felt as though someone had placed their hand on my back. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. I bolted out of the house, but as I did, I heard the voice again. It was the same voice my grandfather had described, calling from inside. "Come here. I have something important to tell you." I froze in place, unable to move. Those words echoed in my mind, beckoning me to return. But just as my grandfather had felt in that moment, I knew staying meant something terrible. Without looking back, I ran, my heart pounding and my eyes struggling to process what was happening. That voice, the same voice, was haunting me. The events didn't stop there. Although I left the house at that moment, the voice I heard never left me. It echoed in my ears like a distant resonance, creeping into my mind everywhere I went. Every time I tried to escape the memory, the voice returned to haunt me in every corner and shadow, as if some unseen force tethered me to my grandfather's past. An ancient past where reality blurred with legend. Days passed, and I tried to resume my normal life, but I couldn't forget what had happened. I searched for answers, wondering if this experience was just a figment of my imagination, or if there was something mysterious controlling that old village. The voice followed me even into my dreams. I'd hear it call my name, ringing in my ears as though escape was impossible. One day, I decided to return to my grandfather. I could no longer bear living with the doubt consuming my heart. My grandfather had lived alone since my grandmother's passing, and despite his advanced age, he refused to leave the house. That home was his lifeblood, and I knew he had answers, even if he was hiding some from me. When I visited him that day, he was sitting in the same spot I had described to you. He was staring into the dark yard, as if seeing something I couldn't. I approached him, trying to mask the tension tightening my chest, but my grandfather didn't need words to sense my unease. "You haven't let the story go, have you?" he asked, looking at me with sharp eyes, as though he could read my very soul. I was taken aback by his words and asked, "What do you mean?" He replied calmly, "You saw what you saw, and I know the voice you heard wasn't just a mirage. You must have felt something strange within you, didn't you?" I nodded, unable to speak, the words choking in my throat. My grandfather gave a mysterious smile and said, "You once told me you believed death was the end of everything. But there are many things in life we cannot see, things that linger even after their owners have passed. Sometimes, a soul doesn't leave easily. It stays trying to leave something behind. A message, perhaps. And if the soul is kind, it may try to protect those it loves." I took a deep breath and asked, "But why? Why me? Why was the voice calling me?" My grandfather looked at me deeply, as if recalling something long forgotten. Then he said in a low voice, "Your grandmother had an extraordinary ability. She could see things others couldn't and hear voices no one else could hear. I saw her many times calling out to people, but she wouldn't appear to them. She was always trying to keep her loved ones safe, even when her soul had left her body." He paused, then added in an unusual tone, "When she passed away, she didn't completely leave us. I don't know how, but I could feel her presence near me, though I couldn't explain it. She would leave me invisible messages, strange occurrences. In moments when I heard her voice, it was because she wanted to warn me." He paused again, then said, "And now it seems the turn has come to you. You're seeing what I saw, hearing what I heard. But you must be careful. You can't ignore what's happening because these forces are following you. They are old, mysterious powers, and there's more to this world than what we see with our eyes." I sat in total silence. I knew my grandfather was telling the truth, and that he no longer cared about sparing my feelings. He lived in his own world, where reality and fantasy intertwined. I could no longer tell them apart. My grandfather looked at me again and said in a heavy voice, "At that moment when you were close to death, it was her soul that saved you. But not everything in this world can be understood. Death isn't the end. It's the beginning of something new. Something humans cannot bear, but must face." The silence in the room was profound. I closed my eyes, thinking about everything my grandfather had said, about the enormous mystery I couldn't decipher. Then, suddenly, I felt something heavy descend upon me, as if it had fallen from the sky, seeping into my heart. It was a voice, a deep voice, familiar and resonant, echoing in my ears. "Come here. I have something important to tell you." It was the same voice, as though my grandmother was watching me, calling me, warning me, and connecting with me in ways I couldn't comprehend. In that moment, I realized there was something far greater than I could grasp, and that I would have to live with this secret forever. The voice became a part of my life, but I learned to coexist with it, just as my grandfather had learned to live with the shadows that had haunted him throughout his life. The story had ended, but in truth, it never truly ended.